Hey guys, welcome to week 2. We are going to now take a look at viruses this week. So we're going to focus on, if you remember last week, I introduced you guys just to microorganisms in general, and we talked about how there's just all kinds of different microorganisms, and some of the most common ones that you guys are going to see, especially when it comes to infections, is going to be bacteria because of bacterial infections, fungi because of fungal infections, and viruses. And viruses are, if you remember, were acellular organisms, which means that they are non-living. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. So let's open up your PowerPoint here. Well, it'll open for me. All right, there we go. So again, we are looking at chapter 4. If you're following along with me in your textbook, chapter 4 is actually 2 parts. And I'm focusing on just the first part today. So kind of short and sweet when it comes to just the lecture part of it, but there's some other things I want you guys to take a look at besides just the lecture. So looking at this, you guys are going to see I've cut it in half. We're looking at just part 1 of chapter 4. So viruses, let's look. So we're looking at acellular organisms here, so viruses. I start off by just showing you guys, again, I mentioned that you guys are going to commonly come across viruses in the nursing field because you guys are going to see viral infections. Excuse me. So this is just an overview of some of your most common viral infections that you guys may see. And there's more than this. This is just a few of them. So it looks crazy. But, we're looking at just some things that you guys might hear as we go through lecture, you guys might see, and you may not come across any of these. I'm sorry, not any of these, but not all of these, but just, again, something to be aware of. And I'm not going to quiz you guys on this picture, so you don't need to worry about this. Just some things to just introduce our viral chapter. So some things you guys may see as we go through this. The adenovirus is something that can cause eye infections. Adenovirus you may see is also down here, which is one of the types of viruses that causes pneumonia. It is one of your common cold viruses. The rhinovirus is another one that causes your common cold. Adenovirus causing pharyngitis, if you remember, is your throat, the pharynx. So pharyngitis, when that becomes inflamed and infected, we're seeing that's one of the causes of that. So again, that's what we're seeing here. Hepatitis is an infection of the liver. So that can be caused by different types of hepatitis viruses. Smallpox we no longer see anymore. Fun fact, smallpox was eliminated. It was completely eradicated in, I think, 1976. So not too long ago, but we no longer have, because of vaccines, we no longer have smallpox anymore. We no longer have the polio virus anymore. So again, because of the great invention of vaccines, we're not seeing these viruses any longer. And the hopeful, hopefully, as scientists and doctors and things are constantly studying medicine, we're hoping we can eradicate more of these illnesses in the future. So just an overview of some of our viral infections there. So here, again, chapter 4 itself, we're looking at acellular and cellular organisms in the second part. Again, we'll see that next class. But here we're going to focus on just this first part, acellular infectious agents, which is going to include your viruses, and then viroids and prions, which are just smaller versions of your virus. And I'll define those for you guys a little bit later. Okay, so microbes. As we mentioned last week, we mentioned that microbes can be divided into those that are truly cellular. And again, remember, if anything possesses cells, it means that they are living, and those that are acellular, so non-living. So again, your cellular organisms are going to include your bacteria, archaea, algae, protozoa, and fungi. And again, remember, we are just focusing on your bacteria and fungi in this class. As you won't commonly see archaea, algae, and protozoa. I don't delete them off the PowerPoints, just so you guys are aware of these particular terms, that they are included in your microorganisms. We just don't focus very heavily on them. And again, those that are acellular, which we are taking a look at today, we're looking at viruses, viroids, and prions. Okay. All right, so looking at the cellular microbes, if you remember from last week too, we also mentioned that those that contain cells, you guys may remember this picture that I drew. So if you guys can see me up in the corner, remember we talked about eukaryotic organisms and prokaryotic organisms, and I drew this silly picture for you guys that said, again, remember eukaryotic organisms were those that contain those membrane organelles. So the example that I used was the nucleus here in the middle. The nucleus is what houses a cell's DNA. So it keeps it contained in the center of that cell. So a eukaryotic organism would include human beings because we have cells that look like that. Whereas prokaryotic organisms like your bacteria that we will see later on next week, your prokaryotic organisms do not have those membrane-bound organelles. So their DNA free floats throughout the cell because it's not contained in that nucleus. It's not contained by that membrane, membrane-bound structure. So that's what we're mentioning there in the second bullet point. So just a reminder there with our cellular organisms, and we'll talk more about those next class when we talk about bacteria, and then in the following class when we talk about fungi. But today we are focusing on viruses. Viruses, viroids, and prions are oftentimes referred to as just acellular microbes because they're not living, and sometimes even they're just called infectious particles because, again, they're not living things. They're really just particles that can cause infection. And today we're going to see how that works, and I'll show you guys what I mean by that. So viruses, when you hear the term viron is really kind of a synonym for viruses because it just means a complete virus particle. Later, we'll take a look at those terms, viroids and prions, and how they're smaller versions of a virus. But all of these terms really kind of encompass the same thing, that viruses, virons, viroids, and prions all fall in that category of non-living particles. But these complete virus particles, when you see that, that's a viron. Remember last week we mentioned we were talking about microscopes and we were talking about measuring. Remember, viruses were smaller than bacteria. They're very, very tiny, and they typically range anywhere from about 10 to 300 nanometers in diameter. Some viruses, looking at, I've skipped this too. If you remember last week, we talked about how microorganisms are ubiquitous, which means that they are found virtually everywhere. Your viruses, when it comes to your infectious viruses, that holds true for them too. And what I mean by that, viruses can pretty much infect anything that's living. It's going to be able to, what it does, a virus actually depends on the host cells. So it's going to be determined, it's going to be determined to use those living cells to cause that infection. So anything that's living can be infected by a virus. So that includes human beings. As we know, we get viruses all the time. Animals can get viruses too. Plants, for anybody who likes to garden, sometimes you may see that your plants sometimes get these like brown spots on the leaves, and sometimes that's caused by a virus. So plants, fungi, protozoa, algae, and even bacteria can become infected by viruses. So just know that viruses can really infect any living thing. Some viruses, and we'll see this term come up a little bit later, when you see the term oncogenic viruses, or sometimes called oncoviruses, they can cause specific types of cancer. If you guys are familiar with the term like oncology is the study of cancer. So if anybody has to go to the oncology department at the hospital, they're probably receiving cancer treatment. So that prefix there hopefully gives you guys kind of a heads up that a virus that can sometimes have the ability to cause cancer is called an oncogenic virus or oncovirus. Okay, a typical viron. So what we're going to talk about in the next couple slides here is how viruses are categorized. Bacteria is going to be a little bit easier when we talk about this next class because bacteria really kind of fall into the category of really 3 different shapes. That's it. Bacteria are either round, rod-shaped, or spiral. I mean, that's pretty much it. Viruses really are varied, greatly. That as far as their shape, as far as, and bacteria as well, that it's not just that. I mean, we're going to categorize bacteria also based on their need for oxygen and, some other things and how they group together. But viruses, really their shape, their size. There's kind of a great variety, as well as their type of DNA that they contain. So the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about really just how varied our viruses can be. And so again, another reason why sometimes viruses are harder to treat when it comes to medication, because they're just so very different. So a typical viron consists of a genome, meaning it contains a certain DNA, which I think I briefly mentioned to you guys, DNA is what gives us, not a cell, I shouldn't say a cell, but a DNA is what gives an organism its like its brain. It's like it tells it what to do. So our DNA is what makes us human. Again, our DNA, for instance, in human, is what tells us what eye color to make. Our DNA is what tells us what hair color we're going to be or what blood type. Tells our neurons that its job is to send messages to and from the brain. For instance, that's what our genetic information does. So a viron contains genetic information, but it's either composed of what's called DNA or RNA. Not that you guys have to know the difference between the two, but we're going to classify viruses. Again, hard to classify because some viruses contain DNA, some contain RNA. And this genome is then surrounded by a capsid, which is just a term that means a protein coat around it, which is composed of protein units called capsomeres. Those capsomeres are those little pieces of protein units that create that capsid. Some viruses, enveloped viruses, they're, again, if you think of what an envelope is, like we use envelopes all the time. It's something that contains, if we think of an envelope containing a letter, but this is a little different. This is what's containing a virus. Enveloped viruses have an outer envelope composed of lipids, which is another term. Lipids and polysaccharides is kind of like lipids are, if we think back to anatomy, lipids are like fats. It's just kind of a cushiony layer that's going to surround the virus and kind of keep it protected. So some viruses have this lipid layer around it called an envelope. So again, another way that we're classifying different bacteria. So some viruses have an envelope, some do not. Some contain DNA, some contain RNA. Some are, most of that, DNA, again, is surrounded by a capsid composed of these capsomeres. So I found this isn't from your textbook. I found this online. I really just thought it was a great picture that shows the different categories of these different viruses that, help us to see just how great and varied viruses can be. Again, like I said, some contain an envelope, some do not. The capsid is shaped differently in different viruses. Again, hard to create vaccines sometimes for these viruses because, again, it's dependent on whether we have to get through an envelope or have to, again, base it on this shape. I mean, it's just, so different. So the capsid symmetry can either be, rod shaped, icosahedral, just so different, in different categories here. And you can see the different shapes down here. And then there's different families that viruses fall into. So these are just a couple examples of those different viruses that you may have heard of. Hepatitis B is one that has a capsid symmetry that's icosahedral. So that's that particular shape. There's an envelope around that particular virus, and it falls into this particular family category of viruses. Herpes virus, there's different types of herpes viruses. Herpes simplex virus looks like this. So you can see the capsid falls into that same icosahedral shape. It is also enveloped. Here's a rod-shaped type bacteria. These are also, icosahedral viruses, but they are non-enveloped. You can see comparing the adenovirus to the herpes virus, you can see that that particular capsid shape here is very similar. But again, the herpes virus has an envelope and adenovirus does not. Parvovirus, which is a virus that can make dogs very, very sick, is again very, that particular capsid shape and also non-enveloped. So again, we're seeing just ways that we can classify. And if you look down underneath, you can see the genome. It talks about how that's going to be categorized as well. Again, sometimes, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this or not, but DNA and RNA can sometimes be double-stranded or single-stranded. And so that's what it's showing you guys down here. So again, lots of different ways that we can classify viruses. And that's where we're going to take a look here, and just more so. Viruses have 5 properties that distinguish them from living things. So I think some things that we've already kind of discussed a little bit already. They possess either DNA or RNA. Living cells contain both. They contain both. Viruses are unable to replicate on their own. If you guys remember from anatomy, for example, skin cells. Skin cells, for instance, if you guys remember, at the bottom layer of our skin, or I'm sorry, the bottom layer of the epidermis, our cells are constantly replicating and creating more, and they slowly push themselves to the surface where they pick up more keratin, become stronger, and eventually at the top of the epidermis, you guys have just a layer of killed off skin cells that are there to protect, and they're filled with keratin as well. That constant replication of our cells is why we constantly have a skin layer, because our skin cells, when they die off, they slowly will flake off, but it's okay because we're constantly creating more. Viruses do not have the ability to do that. Viruses are going to be dependent, in order for them to spread and cause infection, they're going to be dependent on those living cells. They cannot replicate on their own. So very similar, number 3 kind of says the same thing. So unlike cells divide by different means as far as how they replicate. Certain cells divide by what's called binary fission. We're going to see that with some of our bacterial cells. A lot of human cells replicate by what's called mitosis. And then our sex cells, like sperm and eggs, actually divide by meiosis. So those processes are actually what our cells go through in order for them to replicate and create more. But again, viruses don't contain cells. Viruses are going to, be unable to do that. They lack the genes and enzymes necessary for energy production, so they don't have the same energy capability that our cells have. They're going to have to depend on living cells to get that energy production as well. Same thing with, in order for them to, to continue to live and continue to keep, not live, I should say, but to keep, again, replicating, they depend on the ribosomes, enzymes, and metabolites of that host cell for their protein and nucleic acid production, for them to be able to create more viruses to be able to spread. All right. So that's how we can categorize these. So they're classified, as we've mentioned before, their type of genetic material, so either DNA or RNA. The shape and size of their capsid, if you remember from the picture, we saw rod-shaped, and then we saw, again, the icosahedral, the number of their their capsomeres, whether they have an envelope or not, the type of host that it infects, whether it infects a human, a plant, an animal. Remember, we said that viruses can pretty much infect anything, but it's going to be categorized based on how it, what it infects too. The disease that it produces, so what type of disease that it causes, the type of cell that it's targeting in that living thing, and then it's also its immunologic and antigenic properties. So meaning that how it triggers the body to defend itself is what we're looking at here. So here's another picture. This one is in your textbook. Looking at the different shapes and sizes of viruses. Again, just seeing how different all of our viruses are. We can see the polio virus, very tiny up here at the top compared to the adenovirus we saw in that previous picture. The bacteriophage, there's another type of bacteriophage, and this is kind of a common bacteriophage right here, the bacteriophage T2. And then here's chlamydia. You can see just all kinds of different shapes and sizes that we're seeing here. When I say the term bacteriophage, and hopefully you guys can kind of tell by the name, bacterio is the prefix there. This is the term given to viruses that can infect bacteria. Sometimes they're called bacteriophages, and sometimes they're simply just referred to as phages. But I will, guys, on a test, I will always use that prefix that helps out, that helps us to see that a bacteriophage, again, infects bacteria. There are 2 categories of bacteriophages. We have what's called virulent, and you guys, we're going to see that term a couple times. Virulent really just means that it is very infectious. Is kind of a way to think about when we see that term virulent. Later, we'll even talk about the virulence of other microorganisms, and that means its ability to cause infection. So virulent bacteriophages, and then there are temperate bacteriophages. Virulent bacteriophages are always going to cause what's known as the lytic cycle. The lytic cycle, what lysis is in a cell, is the destruction of a cell. It means it causes it to break or rupture, and it destroys it. So virulent bacteriophages are always going to kill off that bacterial cell, unfortunately, whereas temperate may or may not. So that's what that temperate means. Temperate may lead to that lytic cycle, but they may not. They may be able to fight off that bacteriophage. So I would know the difference between the two there. And here's a picture of a bacteriophage. Looks kind of creepy looking there. But a bacteriophage, as you can see what it does, it attaches itself to the outside wall of that bacteria. What it's going to do is it's going to inject its DNA into the cell. And it kind of what it does, and I'll show you guys, there's a video that I'm going to attach to your all's lecture here. So you guys probably already see that there, but gives you a better explanation of this. But what it does is it injects its DNA into the cell and then kind of teaches that cell how to create more viruses. And then that's how they spread and become and again, become so much more infectious. All right, a couple other terms I want you guys to be familiar with. A latent virus. You guys may have heard this before, and actually we'll bring this up a little bit more so later too when we start talking about diagnosing and looking at your different types of infections. But latent means that a virus has the ability to hide from the host's immune system. What it can do is it can enter into the body, and then what it does is it can really just remain dormant. So meaning that it doesn't send any signals to your immune system that tells your immune system you need to fight this off. It can kind of hide from the host immune system because it doesn't do anything. It's not really active at that time. Herpes is a very great example for those of you guys that are familiar with the herpes virus. Once acquired, the herpes virus will kind of always be there, never completely goes away. So herpes virus, again, there's many different forms of the herpes virus. Herpes can cause cold sores, genital herpes, and even chickenpox and shingles fall into that same category of viruses, that same family of viruses. So again, they never completely go away. And anybody like who's, I guess, my age or older, we had the chickenpox when we were little. Now there's a vaccine for chickenpox, but what happens is chickenpox, I'll never get the chickenpox virus again. So I don't have to worry about that. However, the virus still remains in my body and years later may lead to a virus called shingles. Both are the result of the same virus. Or if anybody's familiar with genital herpes or cold sores, sometimes people will get, will have an outbreak of genital herpes, or again, it may have a cold sore show up and then it goes away. So we don't have any symptoms. We don't see any signs of that particular virus, but we may then have an outbreak a little later. So it means, again, it hides in our body, hides from the immune system, and then again can come back and show some signs and symptoms a little bit later. So it is still in the body. It never completely goes away. That's what I mean by a latent infection. All right. So when it comes to treating a virus needs to be treated by an antiviral, meaning that it cannot be treated by an antibiotic, which is typically what's given for bacterial infections. Antibiotic and antibacterial are pretty much the same thing. So they're not going to be effective against a viral infection. For the most part, again, because viruses are kind of harder to treat, a lot of times when you guys have a cold or the flu, those are viruses. Sometimes we just are told that we need to wait it out. We need to let our immune system just take over. We need to just get rest, drink plenty of fluids, and we'll be back in no time. If you guys, I know everybody has experienced a cold and you know exactly what I'm talking about. That you really can't do anything for a cold. You can take NyQuil, that makes you sleep better and feel a little bit better, but that's pretty much it. But in some cases, viruses can be treated, but they have to be treated by an antiviral agent. So an antiviral, those are drugs that are going to be used specifically to treat viral infections. In fact, next, well, not next class, but I think 2 weeks from this week, we're going to take a look at chapter 9, which goes over just that. It really just talks about what's called an antimicrobial, which are these types of medications that are going to treat these microbial infections. So specifically here, since we're talking about viruses, so this will be brought up again, but essentially viruses need to be treated with an antiviral. Bacterial infections need to be treated by an antibacterial. Fungal infections can only be treated by an antifungal. So you guys see where I'm going with this. So sometimes when patients come in and they're sick and they know they're sick, they come in and they just say, I need an antibiotic. I need an antibiotic. Well, they're not sure. They're not exactly sure on what they mean by that because, again, an antibiotic will only treat a bacterial infection. So how these antivirals work, so again, what that patient needs is we need to first figure out what it is that's making them sick. If it is a viral infection, such as the flu or something, then they either need to be given an antiviral. Again, the flu, if you catch it early enough, you can give them Tamiflu, but it has to be pretty early. So most of the time, we're probably just telling them to, you know, again, go home, get some rest, drink some tea, things like that. But again, an antibiotic would be ineffective. It would just be wasteful to just give antibiotics for no reason. So what happens is antivirals, these agents are going to interfere with virus-specific enzymes in that virus production by disrupting these critical phases in the viral multiplication. So again, in that process of, again, I mentioned that a lot of times it's the virus will inject the DNA into that cell and it uses the host cell to kind of teach it how to make more and you know, it causes it to colonize. But an antiviral will interfere with that process. It disrupts these different phases in that multiplication process. Sometimes it'll inhibit the synthesis of that viral DNA, RNA, or those proteins, which are going to be essential to creating more viruses. Because again, remember the DNA and RNA is its genetic information that tells it what it needs to do. And if this drug tells it, no, you can't have that, then again, it's not gonna replicate. So it's good. So that's how these antivirals are going to work. And that's going to stop the virus from spreading. Again, remember I gave you guys earlier the term oncogenic. Oncogenic meaning, again, these are viruses that can cause cancer. So an example would be the Epstein-Barr virus, or probably more familiar, we hear about this one a lot, the human papillomavirus, which again is abbreviated as HPV. You guys have probably seen different commercials on TV for the, you know, different HPV vaccines. But HPV can, especially in females, lead to certain types of cervical cancer. So again, that's why there's that vaccine, because HPV is typically asymptomatic, which means no symptoms. So sometimes people can have HPV and not know anything about it, and not know that they have it, and it can again cause cancer later in life. And then the human immunodeficiency virus, another type of virus that can lead to something else. For those of you guys who are familiar with HIV, you know that this type of virus can sometimes lead to AIDS. Sometimes it can, sometimes it won't. But that is the cause of AIDS, which is the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. It is, just to see what category this falls into, it is an enveloped single-stranded RNA virus. Not that you know that you have to have the specific for HIV, but just know in this slide, we're really just talking about how sometimes viruses can lead to more severe conditions. All right, and there's a picture of our HIV virus. It's almost kind of a pretty looking virus, but again, it can be a very severe virus. All right. As I mentioned before, viroids and prions, I want you guys to be familiar with those terms. Viroids and prions, these are simply just smaller, less complex infectious particles. So they're actually just smaller versions of our viruses. And really, I really just kind of want you guys to be familiar with what they infect is kind of the big thing here. Viroids, these are short, naked fragments of single-stranded RNA, which interfere with the metabolism of plant cells. So viroids are specifically attacking plants. So these are not the viruses that are attacking humans or animals or bacteria. Viroids are targeting your plants. Viroids are transmitted between plants in the same manner as viruses can be, the same way that they spread through contact, through, again, sharing soil and roots getting into contact with one another. So they can be transmitted the same way. So examples of different plant viruses could be the potato spindle tuber and citrus exocortis. Not that you guys have to know those, but if you've heard of those are some examples of some viroids. And prions. Prions, very same idea. They are simply just smaller versions of your viruses. They're small infectious proteins that cause fatal neurological diseases in animals. So different examples that you may have heard of: scrappy bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is mad cow disease, which is probably the more common term that you guys have heard of, and Creutzfeldt-Jacob disease. So these are all just a couple examples. Again, you don't have to know those specifics to those, but mad cow is one that I think we've probably heard of, but it is an example of a serious disease that is caused by a prion. And that's what a prion does. So again, your viroids are smaller versions of your viruses that are attacking plants, and your prions are smaller versions that are attacking animals. So of all the pathogens, prions are the most resistant to disinfectants. So they're really going to be hard to treat. They're really going to be hard to even try to prevent. The mechanism by which prions can cause disease still kind of remains a mystery. So it's something that is still continually being studied by scientists. All right. So that's all that I have in this week's PowerPoint. I did mention that I am going to post, I think viruses are something that sometimes some visuals can be very helpful to better explain viruses. So I'll post a video that I think that I have found that has been pretty interesting to understand viruses a little bit more. And you guys may see that too, since this lecture was so short. So if you guys have any questions at all, you guys know, as usual, just let me know.